The fear of encroaching communism drew America into the conflict of the Vietnam War.
Fear scares the hell out of everybody. And who pays for it?
People were so gung-ho about attacking the North Vietnamese that they made some serious mistakes.
At first, the 400 special forces were just sent as advisors to the Vietnamese, but these numbers were soon to escalate.
The word advisors needs to be taken with a grain of salt. Pilots were flying missions, helicopters, and large amounts of military equipment were being supplied by the United States.
We did the only anti-war covers in America going on then. You couldn't come out against the war. Kids were beaten up by cops in every town and city in America for coming out against the war.
Public opinion, which had supported the war at first, turned when endless battles were shown nightly on television without any sign of success.
Because of the exposure, the American public became suddenly aware of how self-destructive this war was. I was aghast at the number of people who really had no concept at all of what the war was about in a fighting sense.
The age of Aquarius brings civil dissent, peace marches, the death of a president, and a North Vietnamese leader who is playing a patient game.
When you put young men in harm's way, they do bad things.
Were there any Americans who thought the Americans were going to win the war? So what are you doing in the jungle?
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time. Vice President Lyndon Johnson has left the hospital in Dallas, but we do not know to where he has proceeded. Presumably, he will be taking the oath of office shortly and become the 36th President of the United States.
Lyndon Johnson has made his way to the presidential plane. There, he takes the oath of office, ensuring that presidential power is unbroken. The first milestone of his presidency was the signing of the new Civil Rights Act of 1964 into law. The Gulf of Tonkin incident is used by Johnson to launch into the war. He has kept things low-key till now in order to be re-elected. As an ex-Navy man, he is keen to take up the challenge to finish the war and retaliates with air attacks.
The determination of all Americans to carry out our full commitment to the people and to the government of South Vietnam will be redoubled by this outrage.
America has misinterpreted Ho Chi Minh's intentions, and instead of supporting him earlier against the French, they opposed him. Ho Chi Minh was a nationalist, but with no other support, he had to turn to the Russians, into the arms of the communists.
He wasn't a screaming nationalist fanatic. Didn't come across as a fanatic at all.
He wasn't a communist, he was a nationalist. I mean, he was a great hero to his country, you know.
I mean, they called him Uncle Ho, and he looked like your uncle, and he was smiling, and he looked like a lovely guy.
The vast Mekong River can provide food and water and power on a scale to dwarf even our own TVA.
Johnson was in the mindset that if he went in with force, Ho Chi Minh would capitulate. Johnson offers Ho Chi Minh a vast development program for Vietnam if they pull back.
And we remain ready with this purpose for unconditional discussions.
Ho Chi Minh calculates that he and General Giap will eventually rid Vietnam of this American influence in the South.
President Johnson, for all his great virtues, wasn't very strong on foreign policy. He believed that overwhelming force worked. He was a great Texan wheeler-dealer. He figured that if he waved the big stick, he could negotiate with Ho Chi Minh.
Ho Chi Minh didn't want to negotiate with anyone.
In my view, on reflection, of course, is that we may have picked the wrong side when it came to Ho Chi Minh in particular and General Giap. We were stuck with it, and then all these murderous bombing runs began.
Johnson retaliates with Operation Rolling Thunder.
The Americans, not being able politically to invade North Vietnam, tried to bomb it into a car park.
President Johnson is advised that the US airfield at Da Nang is vulnerable to attack from the North Vietnamese, and the South Vietnamese army lacks the strength to defend it.
I have asked the commanding general, General Westmoreland, what more he needs to meet this mounting aggression.
General Westmoreland requests a few battalions to protect the airfield. This is the first of many requests for further troops, and by the end of the year, numbers of US troops would rise to 200,000.
They escalated and escalated. The LBJ escalated it, then everybody was escalating it, you know?
Suddenly, everyone in America is affected.
The bombing campaign and increasing troops does little to stop the North Vietnamese army moving personnel and supplies through Laos and into South Vietnam. American B-52 planes are sent in to bomb North Vietnam for the first time. These continuous, devastating air raids would last for 3 years and include the heavy deployment of Agent Orange.
Agent Orange was actually used on American highways to keep the weeds down off the side of the expressways. But it was used in massive amounts in Vietnam, and there's dioxin, which causes the cancer's birth defects.
As more and more US troops are sent to Vietnam, the stark reality of the war hits home in America.
Anti-war demonstrators protest U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War.
Public support for the war begins to slide as anti-war demonstrations increase in the U.S.
The estimated 125,000 Manhattan marchers include students, housewives, beatnik poets, doctors, businessmen, teachers, priests, and nuns. Makeup and costumes were bizarre.
In a major war effort, the ground offensive, Operation Cedar Falls, begins. 30,000 US and South Vietnamese troops are sent to destroy Viet Cong operations and supply sites near Saigon. Protest rallies and marches against the war in Vietnam continue to increase. Veterans from World War I, World War II, and Korea stage a protest in New York City. Muhammad Ali was world champion from 1964 until 1967, when he was stripped of his titles. He caused a sensation when he refused to be inducted into the army.
You my enemies. My enemies are white people, not Viet Congs or Chinese or Japanese.
That's all. Just no comment on boxing, religion, induction, no comments on the weapon or nothing.
He refused to step forward. He was sentenced to 5 years in jail. They stripped his title. While he was waiting for the Supreme Court to decide his case, he spent his time going to colleges, talked all over the country. He gave young people the guts to come out against the war.
Other artist activists such as Joan Baez, Pete Seeger, and Bob Dylan had joined what was to become an international movement against the Vietnam War. In April 1967, Martin Luther King Jr. makes a powerful speech. Previously, he had not been vocal about Vietnam in order not to upset President Johnson, as the civil rights legislation was going through during his presidency. He speaks out against US policy in Vietnam, calling America the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. He publicly denounces their military presence in Vietnam and proposes a merger of the anti-war and civil rights movement.
The promises of the Great Society have been shot down on the battlefield of Vietnam.
The pursuit of this widened war has narrowed the promised dimensions of the domestic welfare programs, making the poor, white and Negro, bear the heaviest burdens both at the front and at home.
Hey, Joe, where you going with that gun in your head?
In June 1967, the first Monterey Pop Festival takes place, showcasing many artists who've been expressing their anti-Vietnam feelings. When Jimi Hendrix takes to the stage, many young men in the audience already have their draft papers.
You know, I'm gonna mess around with another man.
You had Ravi Shankar on one side, and then you had The Who smashing up guitars on the other, and Jimi Hendrix somewhere in the middle. And that would certainly have been a kind of rallying cry for, increasing anti-Vietnam sentiment.
There have been various incidents of burning draft cards, but this was brought into intense focus when it was acted out in the musical Hair in New York in October 1967.
People in colleges were pretty well organised by this time because they'd been fighting for civil rights. So they knew how to protest. And this essentially divides the country, that the younger generation know how to cause trouble, know how to, if necessary, avoid the draft and flee to Canada, whereas the older people remember World War II and remember being right.
1967. The summer of love had a bloody underbelly. Young American boys are sent to fight their counterparts in Vietnam. This will be brought to a terrifying conflagration with the shock of the Tet Offensive.
What's going on? Yeah, what's going on? Tell me what's going on. I'll tell you what's going on.
Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara visits General Westmoreland to assess the situation on the ground. Their advice to President Johnson is taken up, and troop numbers are eventually increased to more than 500,000. As more and more US troops enter Vietnam, the siege of Khe Sanh begins, and the Marines are cut off.
The United States had begun to suspect that the North Vietnamese strategy was to lure the Americans into a remote outpost. The Americans thought that they could win that if they built up enough forces and win a conventional battle against the North Vietnamese. And so they built up the large base of Khe Sanh. They expected that the attack would come there. And indeed, it built up all through December and January.
However, this was a distraction from the main event. On the night of January 30th, the Vietnamese New Year, some 80,000 Viet Cong attacked 36 capitals, 64 towns, and 4 American bases. Around 4,000 Viet Cong attacked Saigon, occupied the grounds of the US Embassy, and hit General Westmoreland's headquarters. This was known as the Tet Offensive. Americans have to engage intense force to recover from the sudden onslaught.
The Americans think they're in control of the country. Then comes the Tet Offensive. Tet is the Vietnamese Lunar New Year. The Americans say that there's no chance that the Viet Cong are going to attack them during Tet. It would be like starting an offensive on Christmas Day. It wouldn't happen. However, again, nobody read the Vietnamese history books. The Vietnamese won one of their greatest victories against the Chinese, attacking on Tet.
The Tet Offensive was essentially led by the southern Vietnamese communists, the Viet Cong, backed by the North Vietnamese. But it was a Viet Cong-inspired uprising.
Dozens and dozens of cities came under near simultaneous attack by mostly NLF southern guerrillas who had been moved into position largely unknown to the US forces.
Suddenly, every town and city in South Vietnam, there are explosions going off. There's gunfire. The Viet Cong even send squad into the American embassy, and they hold it for hours. This is on American television. The Americans see their own embassy occupied by the enemy.
The fact that the Viet Cong had entered the American embassy in Saigon and caused a great deal of damage shattered public opinion and American faith in winning the war, if the war was ever winnable.
And they can't believe what they're saying. They're being told that they're winning this war, and it doesn't seem that they are.
The battle for Hue was the response to Tet, to endeavor to take back the territory that had been lost to the Viet Cong. It's regarded as one of the bloodiest and longest battles of the Vietnam War, ending in March 1968.
Fighting is violent, and if ever a Marine had to rely on his own quickness and toughness, this was it. House to house, street to street, for 3 long weeks.
Massive retaliation was taken, and the Viet Cong was swept out of the cities and largely annihilated. And this, again, was part of Ho Chi Minh's strategy, because he realized that eventually he was going to win the war, and he didn't want these annoying Southerners, many of whom weren't, the Viet Cong weren't necessarily communists, they were just nationalists. He wanted to get rid of them, and this was a wonderful way to do it.
This meant that the North Vietnamese forces, which had not even appeared in many parts of the South, for instance the Mekong Delta by that time, now began to play a much bigger role in the war, and it became necessary for the Communist forces to have North Vietnamese reinforcements to keep up their level of activity.
After the first day, Marines own just 2 blocks of the city. 2 blocks. And the price is dear.
Militarily, it was a defeat for them, but in political and public relations terms, it was a huge success and badly damaged American morale, particularly at home. And the tide of the war changed.
On the north side of the river, the enemy's position begins to crumble. Marines, along with the South Vietnamese Army, Marine and Ranger units, move into the Imperial Palace.
This great strategist was Ho Chi Minh, because he realized fighting the Americans, it wasn't about what actually happened in Vietnam, it was what happened on the television sets in the United States. So if he could get the war on the news every night, he knew that America would tire of it sooner or later, and he'd get his way.
Finally, the job is finished. 25 days of heavy fighting. Enemy losses in the thousands. And each Marine knows he's been a part of a historic battle. Knows he rates the traditional, well done.
Although America did win back their territory, this was a huge turning point in the war, as America loses its appearance of invincibility.
Vietnam was the first television war. It was on the nightly news in America, and it was on the news here in the UK, and so it had a phenomenal impact.
It was in American living rooms every evening.
It's getting near dawn.
Now CIA men and MPs have gone into the embassy and are trying to get the snipers out.
This is the main Vietnamese language radio station in Saigon. And right now,
and it went on and on and on. And of course, the people in America knew that their sons were going, and there were shots of the body bags coming home. And it's terribly demoralizing. America has this great sort of culture of winning, and they believe that with their wealth, their technical expertise, and their manpower, that they could do anything.
The smoke turned on us again, and out of it, in the briefest lull in the crossfire, soldiers came running out carrying children.
Every time you went around a corner, you see a palm leaf move, and you think, Christ, it's an ambush. Every time you see a junk, you think, it's full of explosives. I mean, this is how American television had weaned me into Vietnam. So I went out there convinced I was either going to be killed or I was going to fail in the story. My very first story in Vietnam, Apocalypse Now, the scene where they're on that little boat, big machine gun up there. Well, that was my first story. River Marine Patrol, it was called. And I was absolutely terrified. I mean, really quite terrified.
Patrols like these in the Mekong Delta are convinced that they're winning their war against the VC. They put as success there, as evidence of their success, the number of VC dead and the number of VC defectors. But they have, nevertheless, the substantial backing of thousands of well-armed and well-trained troops, plus barrack ships, helicopters and gunships, and the River Marine Force.
The problem about TV is that when there were big things happening in Vietnam, your bosses wanted daily news.
Television journalists would go to a battlefield, but they would have to leave the battlefield by a certain time to get back to Saigon Airport and ship their film to Hong Kong.
There were no satellites, of course. We were shooting film. Usually, if you're doing a feature story, we just get to New York, then they would develop it and edit it with your narration. Now, it's sort of hard, I think, for journalists, TV journalists today, to relate to the fact that we were writing our narrations without ever having seen the film that we were narrating. You just watched what you were covering. You watched what your cameraman was filming. You wrote to what you thought he had filmed. And then you laid down the narration, and off it went.
The fire spreads, the people leave, and in no time at all, that area is charred and ruined and destroyed.
You couldn't go too far. So my area of operations tended to be down in the Mekong, which, as it turns out, was a pretty dangerous place to be anyway.
For one moment, they panicked, and rightly so. The mortar hit right in the middle of them down there on the right.
After 6 in the evening, there was nothing to do. That's when we all got into trouble. And now, I mean, there was nothing like 24 hours news. And I remember when the satellite first came up, it was Charles Collingwood who said to me, "Oh, glory days are over. We're going to have to work for a living now."
The journalists working out of Saigon all seem to have a huge affection for the city. It is their retreat from the war, a short helicopter ride away. Nothing could be more of a contrast to the war than their cocktail hour back at the hotels.
We stayed at a hotel in Lam Song Square, which is bang next to the Congress building. The safest part of town. That little center seemed to be protected. Saigon was a fantastic place to be.
They had a very exciting atmosphere. It didn't seem to be in great danger at that time. There were French restaurants, there was an old French residual community there who were very attached to Vietnam, who had Vietnamese wives, a lot of them.
It was French. You know, the wide streets, the plazas, the squares, the trees, the flowers, and the restaurants. You could go to war in the most horrific circumstances and see some rather dreadful things. And then you'd come back and go out into Saigon, cross the road and have the most superb French meal with quite excellent French wine.
The American public has no escape from the war. General Westmoreland's request for more troops had required students to be drafted. This results in an increase in demonstrations as the public feel helpless against this distant struggle. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was developed from earlier footpaths used for trading. It started just south of Hanoi, and due to the mountain range Trong Son, the trail dropped into Laos and Cambodia, and then into South Vietnam west of Dalat. At first, it took several months to reach the south. However, the volume of traffic expanded gradually, from carrying loads on soldiers' backs or in carts, to improvements being made to accommodate heavy trucks. Dotted along the route were fuel storage tanks and field hospitals. The trail was covered by the heavy jungle canopy and therefore hidden from US bombing raids until the bombing became so intense, destroying the jungle and using Agent Orange to defoliate. Even so, the determination of the North Vietnamese would just make another path around to join the trail again. This trail was supplying several 100,000 troops in the south against the US.
My unit was trying to achieve a workable interdiction of the Ho Chi Minh Trail where it came into South Vietnam, north of Saigon. They bombed the Ho Chi Minh Trail with the supply trail that ran down through Laos and latterly through Cambodia.
The Ho Chi Minh Trail was in fact a series of trails, some of them big enough to take vehicles down, but they carried the stuff. It was weapons, food, medicine, that sort of thing, for the fighters in the south, who were either North Vietnamese or Viet Cong. So the bulk of the people we fought in firefights were either North Vietnamese coming down the trail or Viet Cong.
The great story of the war, the best story of the war, was never told. Because the best story of the war was the Ho Chi Minh Trail. How the guys got from North Vietnam, from Hanoi to a large extent, into South Vietnam, and when they got to South Vietnam, managed to fight, is superhuman.
A year of my life was spent either ambushing people or trying to avoid being ambushed by them. That was it. It was ambush warfare, and that's what the nature of the firefights were.
The fantasy, the journalistic fantasy, was to go down the trail with the North Vietnamese. But it never happened.
For years now, the Viet Cong have been strong in the Delta. It's where they've always raised taxes, food, and recruits. And recently, they've even been enrolling boys of 14 and 15. But the Americans say that since the Tet Offensive, Viet Cong tactics have become much more aggressive.
Pressure came down from the top levels to inflate the body count, and sometimes this was done with false reporting of the number of communists killed in particular actions, but also including civilian casualties in the body count.
The Americans thought they'd succeeded in keeping at least the main waterways of the Delta clear of Viet Cong. But now they find that they're not safe even there.
The person who first realized Ho Chi Minh's strategy was Robert McNamara, that the communists were controlling the action in the battlefield. They could attack and run away at will. So they could control how many people they were losing, what their casualties were. And all they were doing was keeping their casualties down to below their birth rate, which meant essentially they could fight forever. And of course, the Americans weren't going to fight forever. Eventually, they'd go home.
The NLF also were able to keep recruiting amongst people who were disillusioned or disgusted by the destruction and the casualties inflicted on the Vietnamese rural population.
It was the kind of place where you had, brothers fighting for the ARVN, the South Vietnamese army run by the South Vietnamese American puppets, and then you had his brother in the Viet Cong. And the Americans could never understand what was going on. They didn't understand the language, they didn't understand the culture. They didn't understand how that was possible. I mean, there weren't any. Can you imagine in the Second World War, you have a GI and his brother is with the Nazis? Unimaginable. But this is what was going on through the whole war.
President Johnson continues this huge US bombing campaign of Rolling Thunder, targeting the Ho Chi Minh Trail in the main. The tonnage of ordnance would surpass all that was dropped in World War II.
In this dirty old part of the city.
Make no mistake about it. I don't want a man in here to go back home thinking otherwise. We are going to win.
You'll be dead before your time is due.
There's another aspect to the war in Vietnam, which is race. This was the first time there was a major commitment of mixed race units. A lot of young black Americans wanted to prove their status in American society, their manhood, if you will. He wanted to get young black men into the army so he could supply proper medical assistance to them, give them education, and get them out of the ghettos and improve their lot. As the war started to go badly, the black guys said, well, hold on, why are we dying over here when the enemy's back home in America?
In the early years of the war, the black and Latino soldiers were professionals in mostly mixed-race units. By the end of 1968, draftees account for over 30% of American troops. Amongst these are many black soldiers who are growing more and more disaffected in what they called a white man's war, when there were so many racial issues to deal with back home. As the casualty rate increased, conscription was now to include college students who had previously been exempt. This meant that although the majority of US soldiers were still volunteers, their numbers now included middle-class white Americans who were forced to defer their university education.
When I first went out there in '68, the majority of the infantrymen were all working-class Americans. But when the Americans abandoned this avoidance of the draft, and suddenly in Vietnam we saw the arrival not of the officer class, but of white middle-class kids in the ranks.
These are young men who have to go and fight, and the draft comes in, and so you may have to fight against your will. And then the whole idea of the draft dodger comes in.
Well, it wasn't the fact so much that they were university students, it was the middle class. The middle class was getting drafted. Not a chance. Forget it, which is why there hasn't been a draft since then. World War II draft was, I mean, everybody believed in the war.
You suddenly had middle-class kids being drafted in to do the same job. And they were writing letters home. Their parents were appealing to the congressmen. And that's when it all started to change.
Giant protests were not even so much the soldiers as their mothers. Because what the hell is my boy doing in Vietnam? He should be doing his graduate work now. Well, you could get a student deferment for a while, but the middle class was getting drafted, which you can make a coherent theory, saying that that's why we lost the war.
They're only going there for a year tour, whereas the Vietnamese fighters are there all the time. So every time you send a fresh young guy who's just come out of college, they have to start again with a new guy who knows nothing.
All the challenges have been met. The enemy is not beaten, but he knows that he has met his master in the field.
President Johnson was under tremendous pressure over the lack of victory in Vietnam. The Battle of Hue had been the response to the Tet Offensive, as US forces managed to regain the territories that had been lost. But all their claims of victory were like dust in the hand, because this amounted to only a stalemate. In addition, at home, despite all his efforts to pass a Civil Rights Act through Congress to become law, the lack of improvement for the black situation caused the Black Power movement to be active against him. The Democratic Party splits into many factions. Johnson does badly in the New Hampshire primary and ends his bid for re-election. The nation is stunned.
With American sons in the field far away, with America's future under challenge right here at home, with our hopes and the world's hopes for peace and the balance every day, I do not believe that I should devote an hour or a day of my time to any personal partisan causes or to any duties other than the awesome duties of this office, the presidency of your country. Accordingly, I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
The famous CBS anchor, Walter Cronkite, he hadn't been in Vietnam since 1965. He went back, saw what he had to see, and said on American television, "We're not winning. Can't win." And at this point, President Johnson said, "If I've lost Walter, I've lost the American public," and he resigns.
A strike in Memphis causes Martin Luther King Jr. to return to his hometown. After his march had been interrupted with civil unrest, he gave his "I Came to the Mountaintop" speech.
And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
At his motel the next day, preparing to leave for another meeting, Martin Luther King Jr. is shot in the head and dies. That April sees the beginning of riots in many US cities.
Like a bird on wire, like a drum in the midnight.
For Ho Chi Minh and General Giap, unification of Vietnam was non-negotiable. Peace talks were just another tactic to slow down the war. In 1966, Ho Chi Minh stated that North Vietnam was willing to make war for the next 20 years. But if the Americans want to make peace, we shall make peace and invite them to afternoon tea. In May 1968, the first peace talks begin in Paris but end in stalemate. This process of meeting for peace talks would continue for more than 4 years. Now that President Johnson's not in the running for re-election, Robert Kennedy is the most promising candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination. On June 5th, Robert Kennedy wins the California primary at the Ambassador Hotel, Los Angeles.
My thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago and let's win there.
Leaving the hotel through the kitchen, he is shot 3 times and dies later in hospital.
And if I ever been unkind.
Robert Kennedy was the great white liberal hope, and he turned against the war in Vietnam, and as his brother had got them in there in the first place, it only seemed apt.
He was a threat to Lyndon Johnson. But Lyndon Johnson, about that time, decided that he would not run in November. And Hubert Humphrey then had to run for president in the Democratic Party, and of course Nixon was against him.
Let me tell you what those 4 years have done to America. The longest war that America's ever had in its history. The worst crime wave we've ever had in our history. The highest taxes we've ever had in our history. The highest rate in the cost of living that we've had in a generation. And the lowest respect for the United States of America in our history.
As the squabbling for the presidential election continues, violent conflict breaks out, particularly in Newark and Detroit. In Chicago, a huge anti-war protest outside the Democratic National Convention leads to ugly clashes with police. Hubert Humphrey gains the Democratic nomination, but loses to Nixon by a majority vote of less than 1%.
Along comes President Nixon, who promises peace with honor, to get the boys out of there, everything's going to be all right.
I decided in my mind, I was in Vietnam at the time, that I would vote for Nixon because he, rather than Hubert Humphrey, would end the war. And he would find some way to extricate the United States out of that mess.
Unfortunately, that's not what he gave America. He pulled some of the people out, but he expanded the war into Cambodia and Laos.
However, less than 2 months into office, President Nixon orders the secret bombing of Cambodia, ostensibly to destroy the Ho Chi Minh Trail and the supply enclaves just over the border. This covert bombing of over 500,000 tons of ordnance would actually stretch across the whole of Cambodia and was carried out without the knowledge of Congress or the US public.
We will aid Cambodia. Cambodia is the Nixon doctrine in its purest form. In Cambodia, what we are doing is helping the Cambodians to help themselves.
As part of Nixon's strategy of reducing soldiers on the ground and attacking the Vietnamese communists while trying to negotiate peace in Paris, he launched an illegal bombing against the Viet Cong camps in Cambodia. And he even followed up that with an illegal invasion.
Richard Nixon gave the order for the strategic bombing of Cambodia using US B-52 high-altitude bombing aircraft, and the escalation of the bombing of Cambodia occurred from March 1969.
The war had then spilt over from South Vietnam. We learnt later there had been secret American bombing going on. The South Vietnamese forces and Americans moved into Cambodia to try and wipe out the Vietnamese communist sanctuary areas in the eastern part of Cambodia, which bordered on South Vietnam.
Ho Chi Minh dies. General Giap carries on the strategy of the war. The age of Aquarius ends with students being shot down by the Ohio National Guard. South Vietnam has lost its US support and fights a desperate war alone against the North. Nixon's secret war crimes are brought to light in the Pentagon Papers.